You know that feeling when you're standing at the airport, watching the minutes tick by on the departures board, and suddenly you realize you've made a mistake that's going to cost you time, money, or maybe even your entire trip. I've seen it happen more times than I can count, both in my years of aviation research and in the countless conversations I've had with travelers who thought they had everything figured out. But here's the question I really want to put in front of you before we go any further. What is the single biggest airport mistake you've ever made? Or the one you're most worried about making now that you're traveling as a senior? I want you to really think about that for a second, because the answer you come up with might actually surprise you, and I genuinely love to hear what comes to mind. So please, drop it in the comments when you get a chance. Because here's the thing, the mistakes we make at airports aren't always the obvious ones. They're not just about forgetting your passport or showing up late. For seniors, the stakes are different. The rules have changed, the technology has moved faster than most of us expected, and the way TSA operates today isn't the same as it was even 5 years ago. And if you're traveling with the same mindset you had a decade ago, you might be setting yourself up for a truly exhausting experience before you even get to your gate. Let me take you through the 12 mistakes I see seniors make over and over again. And I'm not talking about the surface-level stuff you'll find in a quick online listicle. I'm talking about the real, often overlooked, deeply human errors that turn what should be an exciting journey into a stressful ordeal. I've researched the systems, I've spoken with TSA officers off the record, I've sat in airport lounges watching the dynamics play out, and I've made a few of these mistakes myself. So consider this the conversation I wish someone had sat me down for before I started traveling extensively after turning 60. The first mistake, and I cannot stress this enough, is assuming that your physical ability to travel is exactly what it was 20 years ago. There's a kind of pride that creeps in, and I understand it completely. You've been flying for decades. You know the drill. You can handle a heavy carry-on, you can walk briskly from one end of the terminal to the other, and you don't need any special assistance because that's for people who are truly frail. That line of thinking is dangerous, not because it's prideful, but because it ignores the reality of how airports have expanded. Terminals that used to have a 10-minute walk from security to the farthest gate now have 20-minute walks, sometimes longer. And it's not just the distance. It's the fact that you're standing in lines for extended periods, you're lifting bags into overhead bins that are now designed for people taller and younger than you, and you're navigating crowds that move with a kind of aggressive efficiency that didn't exist before. I've watched seniors push themselves to the point of exhaustion before they even board, and then they spend the first day of their vacation recovering instead of enjoying it. The mistake isn't being capable. The mistake is refusing to acknowledge that airports are physically demanding environments, and that requesting a wheelchair or simply taking advantage of priority boarding isn't a sign of weakness. It's a strategy. It's how you conserve your energy for what actually matters. And that ties directly into the second mistake, which is misunderstanding how airport assistance actually works. There's a widespread belief that if you request wheelchair assistance, you're somehow committing yourself to being wheeled through the airport against your will, or that you'll be treated like a burden. That couldn't be further from the truth. What I've learned from researching the systems airlines use is that wheelchair assistance is often managed by third-party contractors who are paid based on efficiency, not on care. That sounds negative, but here's what it means for you. If you wait until you're at the check-in counter to request assistance, you might find yourself waiting 20 or 30 minutes for someone to arrive because those staff members are already assigned to other passengers. The mistake is not pre-booking the assistance when you make your reservation. It's a simple step that so many people overlook because they think they can decide on the day of travel. But by pre-booking, you ensure that the airline has already allocated a team member to meet you at the curb or at check-in. You also guarantee that your seat assignment is coordinated with the assistance, because some airlines will move you closer to the front if they know you'll need help. Without that pre-booking, you're essentially gambling that everything will align perfectly on a day when everything is already chaotic. And let's be honest, when was the last time an airport felt perfectly aligned? Here's where I want to pause and give you something to think about. Have you ever noticed how the conversation around airport security has shifted? It used to be about taking off your shoes and putting liquids in a bag. Now it's about something far more complex, the unpredictability of the screening process itself. And that brings me to the third mistake, which is assuming that TSA PreCheck or Global Entry automatically guarantees you a stress-free security experience. I can't tell you how many seniors I've spoken with who paid for these programs, felt proud of themselves for being savvy travelers, and then showed up to the airport only to discover that the pre-check lane was closed, or that they were randomly selected for additional screening, or that the airline they booked with didn't have their known traveler number attached to the reservation. These programs are fantastic, don't get me wrong, I use them myself. But the mistake is treating them like a magic key rather than what they actually are, which is a privilege that still requires attention. You need to verify that your KTN is on every single reservation. You need to know that not all airports have pre-check lanes open at all hours. And you need to understand that even with pre-check, you can still be selected for additional screening based on a variety of factors that TSA doesn't disclose. The real value of these programs for seniors isn't just the convenience of keeping your shoes on. It's the predictability. It's reducing the number of variables that can go wrong. But if you don't verify the details ahead of time, you're essentially paying for a service that you might not actually receive on the day you need it most. Now, let's talk about medication, because this is where I see the most anxiety and, frankly, the most misinformation. The fourth mistake is traveling with medications in their original prescription bottles. I know that sounds counterintuitive because that's exactly what the TSA website says, right? They recommend keeping medications in their original containers. But here's what the TSA officers I've spoken with have told me off the record. They don't have the time or the authority to verify that the pills in a bottle match the label on that bottle. What they're actually looking for is bulk quantities of unmarked substances or anything that appears to be concealed. The real risk for seniors isn't getting stopped by TSA for having your pills in a weekly organizer. The real risk is losing your medications entirely because your checked bag gets lost, or because you had to gate check your carry-on, or because in the chaos of security, your bag was separated from you. I've seen it happen. A traveler with a carefully organized set of medications for blood pressure, diabetes, and thyroid function puts everything in a beautiful 7-day organizer, but then that organizer ends up in a bag that gets sent to baggage claim while they're boarding a connecting flight. The mistake is not consolidating your essential medications into a single, clearly labeled bag that never leaves your physical possession. And here's a deeper layer. If you're traveling internationally, the rules about medications change entirely. Some countries require that you carry a doctor's letter for any prescription medication, and they absolutely will enforce rules about quantities. I've researched cases where seniors had medications confiscated at customs because they brought a 3-month supply into a country that only allows a 30-day supply. The mistake is assuming that what works for domestic travel will work everywhere else. I want to shift gears here and talk about something that doesn't get nearly enough attention: the airport itself as a physical space. The fifth mistake is underestimating the impact of airport acoustics, lighting, and crowd density on your cognitive load. When you're in your 60s, 70s, or beyond, your brain processes sensory information differently than it did when you were younger. The constant announcements, the overlapping conversations, the bright LED screens changing every few seconds, the fluorescent lighting that seems to flicker just at the edge of perception, all of that adds up to something researchers call cognitive fatigue. And cognitive fatigue leads to poor decision-making. It's why you might find yourself standing at a gate that's not actually your gate, or why you might misread the departures board and head to the wrong concourse. The mistake is not giving yourself a buffer, not just a time buffer, but a sensory buffer. I always advise seniors to identify a quiet area near their gate before they settle in. Many airports now have quiet rooms, meditation spaces, or simply less trafficked corridors where you can sit away from the chaos. Finding that space before you need it is the key. If you wait until you're already overwhelmed, you're less likely to have the mental clarity to locate it. And here's a trick that most people don't think about. Noise-canceling headphones or even just foam earplugs can dramatically reduce your cognitive load. You don't have to block out everything, but lowering the ambient noise gives your brain a chance to focus on what actually matters, which is your flight information, your boarding time, and your own physical comfort. The sixth mistake is directly related to that sensory overload, and it's one that makes me genuinely frustrated when I see it happening. It's relying on the overhead announcements. I cannot count how many seniors I've watched sitting calmly at a gate, completely unaware that their flight has been moved to a different gate because they were waiting for an announcement that either never came or was so garbled by the airport's PA system that they couldn't understand it. The reality is that airlines today rely heavily on their apps and text alerts to communicate gate changes, delays, and boarding updates. If you're not signed up for those alerts, or if you're not actively checking the app, you're essentially flying blind. I've researched the way airlines handle gate changes, and what I've found is that the algorithm often updates the digital displays and sends push notifications before the gate agent even knows there's been a change. So by the time an announcement is made, the people who were paying attention to their phones have already been walking toward the new gate for 5 minutes. The mistake is treating the airport experience like it's still 1995. It's not. The information flows through digital channels first, and if you're not plugged into those channels, you're always going to be a step behind. Now, let's talk about something that feels uncomfortable but needs to be addressed: mobility devices and the way they're treated by airlines. The seventh mistake is assuming that your walker, cane, or scooter will be handled with care and returned to you in the same condition it was in when you checked it. The stories I've heard from travelers and the data I've reviewed from aviation incident reports paint a picture that airlines don't want you to see. Mobility devices are frequently damaged during handling, not necessarily because of malicious intent, but because the baggage systems aren't designed for them. The mistake is not protecting your device before you hand it over. If you use a walker, you should be wrapping any loose parts, removing anything that can be detached, and taking a photo of it in its pre-flight condition. More importantly, you should be asking the gate agent if you can gate check the device, meaning you keep it with you until you're actually boarding and it's placed in the cargo hold at the last possible moment. That significantly reduces the amount of handling it goes through. But here's the deeper issue. Many seniors are reluctant to request that their device be brought to the aircraft door upon arrival because they don't want to be a burden. They'll walk off the plane without it, assuming they can manage with the airport's wheelchairs. And then they discover that the airport's wheelchair service is backed up and they're standing in a jetway for 20 minutes while everyone else has already left. The mistake is not being assertive about your needs. You are not a burden. You are a passenger who is paid for a service, and that service includes getting you and your equipment from point A to point B safely. I want to take a moment here to address something that's rarely discussed in travel articles but comes up constantly in my conversations with senior travelers. The eighth mistake is traveling with a companion who isn't prepared for the realities of airport assistance. This one is delicate because it involves family dynamics. You might be traveling with your spouse, your adult child, or a friend, and on the surface, it seems like having a companion solves all the logistical problems. But what I've observed is that companions often don't realize the level of support that's actually needed until they're in the middle of the airport. They might be dealing with their own luggage, their own stress, their own time constraints. And when things go wrong, which they often do, the companion's stress compounds your own. The mistake is not having a candid conversation before you travel about what assistance actually looks like. Does your companion know how to lift your carry-on into the overhead bin? Do they know how to request wheelchair assistance if you suddenly need it? Do they have copies of your medications, your itinerary, and your emergency contacts? I've seen situations where a senior became ill during a layover, and their companion was so overwhelmed by the logistics of rebooking flights and coordinating with the airline that they couldn't provide the emotional or physical support that was needed. The solution isn't to avoid traveling with companions. It's to treat your companion as a partner in the travel process, not just a travel buddy. That means sharing information, dividing responsibilities, and having a plan for worst-case scenarios before you ever leave home. The ninth mistake is one that seems almost too simple, but I promise you it's more common than you think. It's wearing the wrong shoes. Not just uncomfortable shoes, but shoes that actively work against you during the airport process. I'm not talking about fashion choices. I'm talking about shoes that are difficult to remove and put back on during security, shoes that lack proper arch support for long walks, and shoes that don't accommodate the swelling that happens to feet during air travel. I've researched the biomechanics of walking through airports, and what I've found is that the average passenger walks between 2 and 5 miles in a large hub airport. For seniors, that distance on hard surfaces with the wrong footwear can lead to blisters, joint pain, and even falls. And a fall in an airport is not just painful. It can derail your entire trip. The mistake is prioritizing ease of packing or style over functionality. I always tell people to choose shoes that are slip-on, secure, and supportive. Lace-up shoes that require you to sit down and re-tie them after security are a recipe for frustration. Flimsy sandals that offer no support are an invitation to foot fatigue. And here's something most people don't consider. The floors in airports are often polished concrete or tile, which can be extremely slippery when wet. If you're walking through a terminal after a cleaning crew has passed through, or if you're in an area where people have tracked in rain or snow, your footwear becomes a safety issue. So when you're packing, don't just think about what you want to wear on the plane. Think about what you need to wear to navigate the airport safely and comfortably. Let's move to something that hits close to home for many of us. The 10th mistake is overpacking your carry-on. I know, you've heard this 1,000 times. But let me give you a different perspective. When you're a senior, the weight of your carry-on matters in ways that go beyond just lifting it into the overhead bin. It matters during security when you have to lift it onto the conveyor belt. It matters during boarding when you're navigating narrow aisles with people pressing in behind you. It matters during deplaning when you're trying to retrieve it while everyone else is impatiently waiting. And it matters most of all during connections, when you might have to carry that bag from one end of the terminal to the other with no time to rest. I've seen seniors with carry-ons that clearly weigh 30 or 40 pounds, and they're struggling, but they're too stubborn to admit that it's too much. The mistake is not being realistic about your physical capacity. And here's where I'm going to challenge a common belief. The idea that you should never check a bag because you might lose it is a fear that keeps people carrying more than they should. Yes, bags get lost, but the percentage of bags that are permanently lost is minuscule. The vast majority of delayed bags are delivered within 24 hours. So ask yourself this: is the stress of hauling a heavy bag through the airport worth the small risk that you might be without your clothes for a day? For many seniors, the answer is no. It's far better to check your larger bag, keep a small, lightweight personal item with your medications, valuables, and a change of clothes, and move through the airport with freedom and ease. The weight you're carrying is not just physical, it's mental. Every pound you're hauling is a pound of stress you're adding to your experience. I want to talk about hydration and nutrition now, because the 11th mistake is one that seems harmless, but can have serious consequences. It's not eating or drinking properly before and during your airport experience. There's a common pattern I see. Seniors are so focused on getting to the airport on time, getting through security, and getting to their gate that they forget to eat. Or they deliberately avoid drinking because they don't want to have to use the airport restrooms. And then they board the plane dehydrated with low blood sugar, and they spend the flight feeling dizzy, weak, and anxious. Dehydration at altitude is no joke. The cabin air in an airplane has extremely low humidity, and your body loses moisture faster than it does on the ground. If you start that process already dehydrated, you're setting yourself up for headaches, muscle cramps, and in severe cases, confusion or even fainting. The mistake is treating food and water as optional during the airport process. They're not. You need to plan for a meal or at least a substantial snack after you clear security. And you need to drink water, not coffee or alcohol, consistently from the time you arrive at the airport until you're settled on the plane. I know the idea of using an airport restroom isn't appealing, but I promise you it's better than the alternative. And here's a tip that most people don't consider. If you're concerned about finding a restroom that's clean and accessible, many airports now have companion care restrooms that are larger, more private, and often located near the gates. Don't be shy about asking an airport employee where the nearest one is. Your comfort and health are far more important than any perceived inconvenience. The 12th and final mistake is the one that ties all the others together, and it's the one that I see cause the most grief. It's not having a contingency plan for the unexpected. We're all guilty of assuming that if we just do everything right, everything will go smoothly. But the reality of air travel today is that things go wrong with alarming frequency. Flights are delayed or canceled, connections are missed, bags are lost, medical issues arise. And when these things happen, seniors are often the most vulnerable because they're not prepared to navigate the chaos. The mistake is not having a plan B. And by plan B, I don't just mean having a credit card with a high limit. I mean having a specific strategy for what you'll do if your flight is canceled. Do you know the phone number for your airline's dedicated customer service line? Do you have the app installed on your phone and logged in so you can rebook yourself instantly? Do you know which hotels near the airport are accessible and have availability? Do you have a portable charger to keep your phone powered when all the airport outlets are taken? Do you have a small bag of essentials in your carry-on that would get you through a night away from home? These aren't paranoid questions, they're practical ones. I've spent years researching how airlines handle irregular operations, and what I've learned is that the passengers who get rebooked first, who get hotel vouchers first, who get out of the airport first, are the ones who act immediately and decisively. They don't stand in the long line at the customer service counter. They're on their phones, using the app, calling the dedicated number, and securing their options before the masses even realize what's happening. For seniors, this is especially critical because standing in a long line for an hour or more is physically exhausting and emotionally draining. The time to prepare for a disruption is before you ever leave home. Have the numbers saved, have the apps installed, know your options, and most importantly, have a mindset that accepts that disruptions are possible and that you have a plan to handle them. As I'm bringing this all together, I want you to think back to that question I asked at the beginning about your biggest airport mistake. I hope by now you're starting to see that the mistakes we make aren't usually about forgetting something obvious. They're about assumptions we carry with us, assumptions about our own abilities, assumptions about how airports work, assumptions about what we can handle. And those assumptions, when they're not examined, become the things that trip us up at the worst possible moment. I've spent decades watching airports evolve, researching the systems behind the chaos, and talking with travelers who've had both the best and worst experiences of their lives in these massive, impersonal spaces. What I've come to understand is that the airport is not a place where you can just coast on autopilot. It demands your attention, your preparation, and your willingness to adapt. But here's the good news. Every single mistake I've outlined today is avoidable. Every single one comes down to a choice you make before you travel. Will you pre-book the assistance? Will you verify your pre-check status? Will you pack light and wear the right shoes? Will you have a contingency plan? These aren't difficult choices, but they do require you to be honest with yourself about what you need and what you can handle. I'm going to leave you with one final thought that I hope stays with you the next time you're planning a trip. The goal of airport travel isn't to prove how independent you are. It's to get from your front door to your destination with your energy, your health, and your peace of mind intact. Everything else is just noise. So when you're making your plans, when you're packing your bags, when you're standing in that security line, ask yourself not what you used to be able to do, but what you need to do right now to make this journey successful. And if you've got a story about a time you learned one of these lessons the hard way, or if you've got your own strategies that have made airport travel easier as you've gotten older, I genuinely want to hear them. Drop them in the comments, because the best advice often comes from people who've been there, figured it out, and are willing to share what they've learned. Safe travels, and here's to many more journeys with far fewer surprises.